Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am very happy to be with you on this Friday. Yes, it is Friday. It is not Tuesday. You're not going crazy. You've looked at your calendar correctly. It is, in fact, Friday. I had a need to reschedule. Wasn't feeling great on the day that the interview was initially scheduled for. And the author, Zachary Hagen, was very kind and willing to reschedule, and so feeling much better. I'm grateful that he was willing to reschedule, but did push back the day that the episode is airing from Tuesday to Friday this week. So thank you for your patience. Thank you to the author for his patience and his flexibility. I hope you've had a great week. This is Friday. Maybe you have some great weekend plans. I had an excellent week because my hubby is finally home. He has been helping his parents, for those of you who are regular listeners, and he's been gone for a while now, so it was great to go to the airport and pick him up on Wednesday. The dogs were so excited to see him. The girl dog punished him a little bit with just turning her back on him and not making eye contact, but they're back to their normal he's the best thing since sliced bread attitude toward him, and much snuggling has ensued, so very, very happy to have him home. And I did not punish him. I've not been glaring at him or refusing to make eye contact that I'm aware of. Hopefully I'm not doing that subconsciously. Anyway, good week for that reason that he is back. And good week because I get to share an author interview with you. As I mentioned, I am speaking this week with author Zachary Hagen. We are talking about his young adult fantasy series. There are 2 books currently out, Eternity's Well and Eternity's Mirror. Let me go ahead and give you the description from Eternity's Well, since that is the book that starts the whole series. When you lose family, friends, and country, how far is too far? Elior watched as his twin brother, the only real family he had left, run into a building as it disappeared. Nyx, a cursed merman, watched as his father and best friend were killed in front of him. Opal's father died, leaving her with a legacy to live up to and a throne to protect. When they join forces with a wise professor to find the Well of Eternity, can they find answers to their problems? Can the ancient evil lurking in the shadows of society be stopped before it's too late? Or will blood be spilled, killing their hope and dooming Lux Terra forever? So, as I said, this is young adult fantasy. There are also a lot of world religious themes throughout the stories, the first 2 books, in terms of allegories and myths and cultural references from a lot of different world religions. So that is an aspect. It's urban fantasy to an extent, but not urban fantasy where the fantasy world is more hidden from the rest of the world. It's just incorporated. It is the world. As I say in the interview, the dwarves drive cars and the fairies go to movies and those sorts of things. So it's all incorporated into one world of Lux Terra in this first story. So there's that, and then of the 3 main characters who are in this book, Elior is human, Nyx is a merman, and Opal is a dwarf. So you have your representation that way, and then there's lots of side characters that come in from different fantasy races throughout the story. So you get the first 2 books, as I said, are already out, Eternity's Well and then Eternity's Mirror. They start on their quest. They each have their reasons for, of course, going on the quest. Each have the the answers they are seeking to try to fix what is happening in their own lives, in their own countries. And then there's, of course, a much bigger story in terms of where the bad guys come in. And as always, I don't want to give too much away, and we are going to talk more about it in the interview. So without further ado, let's go ahead and turn to that interview. Again, the author is Zachary Hagen, and the books are Eternity's Well and Eternity's Mirror. Hi, Zachary. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Sarah.
Thank you for being here. I'm excited to talk about your Eternity series. Before we talk about the books, though, if you could start by just sharing a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you a little bit.
Sure. So I am a teacher by day, creator of worlds and stories by night. I am married, have been for close to 3 years now to a wonderful woman named Claudia, and the first book in the series is actually dedicated to her. And we have a dog, and we're hoping to have a child here soon. So we're just kind of very excited about life, and I'm excited about my writing and my teaching career, and life is good right now after some time with the pandemic and things like that, kind of not having it be so good. So I am reasonably happy right now, and we are enjoying life.
Reasonably happy is a good thing. That's what we can all hope for. Absolutely. Well, let's talk about the series. There's currently 2 books out in the series. So if you could start with an overview of the series as a whole.
Sure. So the Eternal Chronicles goes from this sort of pivotal moment of loss for our 3 main characters in the first book, and the cast grows a little bit. But we explore themes about loss and learning how to find new meaning in the world when our ideas of ourselves change. And we explore that in a world where anything can happen. There's an ancient dragon race that was turned into fiery djinn. There are mermaids, there are fairies and elves, and a dwarf queen, and lots of fun with royalty and magic and swordplay.
And it's fascinating to me because it's urban fantasy, but it's also kind of not urban fantasy. Like when I think about urban fantasy, I think about the fantastic realms, the elves, the dwarves, etc., kind of existing in more of a hidden aspect of the world. Mm-hmm. But this is the world, like our regular world, just the dwarves drive cars and they go to movies and they do all of those things.
Yeah.
And so can you talk about the world building?
Absolutely. Years and years ago, when the first seeds of this story started to form, I had this sort of idea, like, what if our world was a fantasy world? And then I saw the trailer for Onward, and I thought, well, Disney beat me to it, but I'm still going to do it anyway. So I had this sort of an idea, well, what if we had a world where not only did they have all of the modern conveniences that we have, but what if they had somehow used magic to create clean energy? And so they've sort of gone through a second industrial revolution using magical energy rather than fossil fuels and things like that. It really, a lot of it started from other sources as well. I really loved the Last Airbender series and their take on technology and how that sort of played in with the story. And so I really wanted to create a system that dealt with that. So there's a lot of magic technology, sort of the marriage between science and engineering and the magic of the world and how it's used. It's kind of the biggest way in which the characters interact with magic on a daily basis.
And was that kind of your initial inspiration for the series, or was there another impetus to write the story?
I think it was just kind of a lot of things coming together all at once. There was this sense of I really wanted to write something involving a group of sorcerers. Originally, they were the good guys. I don't remember what the goal was in that. But initially, the main character was part of the circle that the villain Tariq put together. So it changed quite a bit. So I don't know that there was kind of a one point or one spark that became the impetus for the whole story. It sort of came from a lot of different places and solidified into a cohesive whole somewhere along the way.
That's actually fascinating. When I stopped to try to put one of the main characters into that circle, that would be a very different story.
It would have been a very different story. I don't think that it would have had the same stakes because, of course, Elior, the main character, I think one of the strengths of his character is that he's so not powerful, particularly in the first book. And over the series, that power grows, but largely because of his connection to other characters and to the world around him.
Yeah, he's not an anti-hero, but he's definitely flawed, which is good. I mean, you need to see a little bit of yourself sometimes in those characters.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's go ahead and take our first break. When we come back, Zachary will be speaking more about the main characters in the books and what about each of those characters might resonate with readers. And it's always fun when you have multiple main characters in a book because you are more likely to see bits and pieces of yourself in a variety of characters. Sometimes you see yourself in one main character, but you're, like I said, more likely to see yourself in a cast of main characters. So we'll talk more about them when we return. You are listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Zachary Hagen about his young adult fantasy series, the first two books of which are already out, Eternity's Well and Eternity's Mirror. Let's go ahead and return to that interview. Can we talk a little bit more about, Opal, Nereza, and Elior in the first book, Nyx in the first book, and then Nereza gets added. Can we talk a little bit about those the core characters and what about each of them might resonate with readers?
Absolutely. I think that Nyx is sort of that fun-loving surfer kind of guy in my head, and so he's easygoing. But he also he cares about things deeply, and I think that that's something that we don't see a lot from that kind of character, where there's real substance to them. Oftentimes they're just the comic relief. So I think that someone who's the funny friend or who has those quirks might find themselves with Nyx. I actually had several people telling me he was their favorite character when I was doing beta testing and beta reading for it, which was great because that told me that I can't really kill this character off because I was actually planning on doing that at the second book. But
you could.
I decided to keep him. So he got to stick around because everyone just really loved that character so much. Opal, I don't know. Did you ever see Even Stevens as a kid?
Oh, bits and pieces, but not much.
Okay. So I sort of fashioned part of Opal's personality after what I remembered from the Ren character, because she's kind of got this shell around her that she has to get out of to figure out who she is and how she fits into the story. Really the only reason that she joins the quest in the first book is because she has to. She's not really given another choice. She um, has a comfortable life. I mean, she's royalty, she's a queen. Um, and that shifts, she has to figure out what her destiny is. And I think that for a lot of young women today, it's that figuring out, because there's societal pressures on both sides. There's this idea that family is important, but people get looked, or particularly women, get looked down on for choosing that. And so Opal has this impetus to choose something and to create a destiny that's hers without outside pressure, which is difficult for someone in the position of, having an entire country on your shoulders to do that. So I think that particularly young women who want to have a solid role model, a character that they can relate to, where things are changing and destiny can mean a million different things, that she's a really good character for them. Nereza, I think that she's kind of the most put together of the core group. She kind of knows exactly what she wants, and she's a really good foil for Elior, because Elior is figuring that stuff out for himself too. There's so much upheaval with his family situation and rescuing his brother, that there's this huge sort of hole in his life where he doesn't have enough stability within himself. And I think that Nereza provides that for him and adds to the group a grounding that the others don't have.
Mm-hmm. And a little off topic, but still about characters. Elior's father plays a role in the book, and I don't always like to give too much away about what goes on in books, but his name, Irakaz, is how I was pronouncing it. Don't know how you pronounce it in your head, but that's Zachary
it's
backwards,
close.
Right?
It's close to Zachary backwards.
It's not your spelling of Zachary backwards, but it.
Yeah, I added the K. It looked better on the page that way. I was scrolling through Facebook one day, and this is a horrible way to get a character name, but it worked. Irakaz, the post said something about your name backwards is the perfect supervillain name. And so I tried it, and like, if I rearrange the letters a little bit, it kind of is a perfect villain name. So I changed the C to a K because it read better, and I moved a couple letters around, and it worked.
No, I like it. I was trying to pronounce it, and then I was looking at it, and I'm like, wait a minute, as I'm spelling it backwards. So I wanted to ask, but I am terrible at coming up with names. So whatever not trigger prompt you can have to help you with names, I think is great.
Mm-hmm. I created a few rules for character names. Like, all of the Jinn will have Arabic-based names because their country and their culture is based around Islamic mythology about Jinn and the sort of their version of how, like, the big bad in their, I guess, belief came to be, which is sort of how we got the Jinn. Because they're made out of fire and blood in my universe. And the Islamic folktales, they're made out of strictly fire, but kind of drawing on the same principles. And so all of their names are, at least most of the time, most of them are Arabic. Most of the Mer people's names have to do something with a water spirit or aquatic something. And all of the royal humans have names that start with EL for the males and EM for the females.
All right, yeah, that's good that you to have the guidelines. I think would be very helpful.
It made things a lot easier.
again, without giving too much away for people who haven't read the first book, can you talk a little bit about the second book and how it continues the story?
Sure. So it picks up where the last one left off. Of course, they oh, it's hard to try to talk about it without giving something away.
I know.
Their journey continues. The events of the first book force them into accepting a new reality. Tariq is hell-bent on taking over the world and wresting power away from the Great Spirit and those who remain loyal to him. And so he's determined to push that. And so he continues to take over the world in his sort of pseudo-political way. Our heroes need a way to stop that. And they didn't find the answers to all their questions in the first book. And so they have to go to an entirely new place to figure that out, something that's beyond what they believed possible.
And since their story is ongoing, do you have the overall arc in mind for how many books you want in the series, or is well, I'll just leave it at that. Do you have an overall arc for a number of books?
There's going to be 5 books in the main series. After that, I'll probably take a little bit of a break from Lux Terra, but I do have some spin-offs ready to go as well.
Okay. What types of research did you do for the series?
So I do cultural research. So if anyone's listened to the audiobook, you'll know that the Dwarven culture is influenced by Scotland. The human culture is largely American. I wanted it to be an American fantasy. Most of the fantasies out there are written by British authors or are meant to be set in Europe, and I wanted a different flavor for this one. The Mer culture is based largely in Greek culture, and as I mentioned, the Arabic culture of the Middle East, sort of that overarching mythos influenced the Jinn quite a bit. I think of the elves as sort of Norse. So I've taken more from the Norse mythology of elves for them rather than sort of the Middle Earth kind of thing.
Time for the second break of the podcast, but when we come back, we'll be talking more about character development. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with author Zachary Hagen about the first 2 books in his Eternal Chronicles. Let's go ahead and return to that interview. In terms of character development, when you sit down to write a new story or a new character, do you have a pretty solidified image of that character before you start writing, or does that develop more as you write the character?
It totally depends on the character. Elior, because he was the main character from the very beginning when I started developing the story, by the time I started writing him, I knew him really well. And so I didn't have, so he's just sort of evolved organically as I got to know the story that I wanted to write. With certain characters, I do have to write out a little bit more about them. Nereza was kind of hard to nail down for me because I knew that I wanted to introduce a romantic interest into the book, but I didn't quite know who she was. And so I had to think about who her interest was going to be and what a good balance would be there. So I had to kind of sit with her and wrestle with that a bit and create a little bit more specifically because she had to be the character that she needed to be. Opal and Nyx were a little bit more organic. I started writing them and they changed actually quite a bit over the course of the first draft of edits. Opal used to be a lot more stuck up than she is now. I think she's a lot nicer of a character. So that changed quite a bit. Elior, he didn't change a lot. I will say he got less whiny. In the first draft of the book, I was going through a lot of grief myself, and so he was crying every other page, which changed in the second draft. Moving forward, Nyx became a little bit more serious once people really started liking him. I knew that he had to have more stability and more substance to him as well. So there's a little bit of a give and take, I think, for me. There's some really delving into characters when I really don't know them, and there's some just letting them become who they are on the page. Now, of course, the main cast of characters I know really well. I've written 3 stories with them, and so jumping into the 4th book, I don't have to do a whole lot of character development because I'm not really introducing any real main cast characters anymore. With the 3rd book, we're sort of, or with the 4th book, well, I've written the 3rd, the 4th is, I'm starting to work on it now. So now I'm kind of at that last 2 entries where the characters are really well developed and I know exactly who they are. So any sort of getting to know them has happened.
Mm-hmm. And so you're starting to work on the 4th one. You finished the 3rd one. Do you have a release date for the 3rd book?
The 3rd book, if people look on my website, it does say the 11th of this month, but it is going to be November. I had to push it due to scheduling conflicts.
They happen, but it's coming
November
soon.
11th. So
that's always good for people who are waiting for the next book, that you didn't just say, yeah, it'll be out in a year.
Oh, goodness. I don't think I could do that to myself or to the fans of the series.
It's such a typical fantasy thing, though.
It's true.
Speaking of fantasy, what draws you to writing in this genre?
I think largely because I read in fantasy a lot. Some of my favorite books were The Inheritance Cycle and The Chronicles of Narnia, and to a certain extent, The Lord of the Rings, although I have the cardinal sin of believing the movies are actually better with those. But I still really love the universe that J.R.R. Tolkien created.
I can see where you're coming from on that one because he's very, very wordy. So visually, it's much easier.
Very wordy. And for me, I have really severe ADHD. And so I have never actually been able to get through the books because there's just so much detail and there's so much to be distracted by.
Mm-hmm.
But I've enjoyed the movies and I've enjoyed the snippets that I've read here and there. I think that somewhere in my book hoard, as I call it, there is an antique copy of The Hobbit with a bookmark still in it from the time I put it down about 15 years ago. So
well,
probably will not be finishing reading it. But I've read a ton of other books.
Yeah, and yeah, it's just everyone's reading style is different, and those are very, very wordy. As I said, I was reading them on the plane. I was reading the last one in the Lord of the Rings trilogy on a plane once, and it was wrapping up nicely. And I looked, and I still had 100 pages or 50 or 200 pages left, and I thought, oh, kidoki, we're not.
Yeah.
There's like 10 different
Yeah.
endings to that book.
Oh, I know. I used to think when I started writing that I would have epics the size of Tolkien's work. And I think the longest book, I think, wraps up right around 85,000 words. And that's the first book in the series.
Mm-hmm.
The second wrapped up right around 75,000. The third is sitting at 83,000. I don't know if it'll change any more than that, just because it's kind of done with the editing process at this point. There might be a couple more changes before it gets sent to presses, but nothing that's going to impact it more than a couple words here or there, because I mean, the story is set and most of this wording is set. So,
Right. Yeah. But when it's a series, I don't think you need huge long books always, because the story continues in each book, but each book doesn't have to be the series length.
right. I think that, had I been more Tolkien-esque in my writing style, the first and second books might have been combined into one, which might have felt more like a payoff to some readers to have both of them together. But I'll tell you what, once you've written about 80,000 words, you're ready for it to be done, unless you are extremely long-winded as a person.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine. When it comes to writing, for publication in this case, is it something that you always wanted to do, or is it something that you came upon later in life? How did that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, I always wanted to write, and that's been well documented in a lot of interviews that I've done. But as far as publication, I think that my opinions on that changed a lot. Originally, my thought was I'm going to find an agent and I'm going to get it published traditionally. And then I thought, well, why don't I do self-publishing? And then sort of the third option of, well, I love books and editing. I could just start a business and do my own indie press and get the best of both worlds, which is what I ended up doing. So I think my path to publishing changed quite a bit from the inception of the desire to write and for others to be able to read what I've written to actually executing that.
Mm-hmm. So you are a teacher, you are an author, and you formed your own publishing company, is what I'm hearing, yes?
Yes, you say that all out loud, and it sounds incredibly pretentious.
It sounds like you don't sleep,
immediately
maybe.
thinking that I would do everything under the sun.
But I guess my follow-up question would be, you have a family. How do you balance everything?
I wish I could tell you, but I absolutely have no idea. The only
Or that
answer
could just be ADHD at its best.
it could be. I think that the key to balance is important things first. I tell people, if you're religious, you need to spend time in your devotionals and in your meditation. That needs to be the first thing that you do every day. Because spirituality, I believe that we're spiritual beings. We were created to worship and to focus our minds on that realm, which is part of the reason it plays such a big theme in my books, because I think that's so integral to what human beings are. So I start my days with that centering exercise. I take the time to devote and to pray, and I think that personally helps me to center enough that other things kind of fall into place after that. So, maybe it's me, but I'm going to give the credit elsewhere because I don't feel like it's me doing it, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And it is now time for our final break of the podcast. But when we come back, Zachary will be giving his advice for aspiring authors. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Zachary Hagen. From your experience as an editor, as a writer, as a teacher, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
Absolutely. If you are a person who wants to learn how to write, or maybe you know how to write and you're just trying to get something done and out, don't stop asking what if. Allow yourself to ask what if and answer it in the way that only you can. Somewhere in the world, there is someone who wants to read your story, and that means that you have to give yourself permission to dream and ask questions about the worlds that you want to create.
All right, thank you for that. In terms of your personal reading, when you take time to read for yourself, do you have favorite go-to authors and genres?
I have been trying to expand that recently. So I have recently read The Lunar Chronicles. I loved those. I believe that's by Marissa Meyer. Fantastic fairy tale retellings in sort of a sci-fi fantasy mixture. So I loved that because it was right up my alley. I have also recently started reading Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. So I tend to stay in the YA genre a lot of the time, but occasionally I'll venture out and go more mature. It's just kind of rare that I do that.
Mm-hmm. Right. I know you have a website, so if you can share your website as well as any social media that people can find you on.
Absolutely. So my website is zacharyhagenwrites.com, and all of my social media is ZacharyHagen_writes.
Easy enough. Thank you. Zachary, we've talked about the books and writing and a variety of topics, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to highlight during this time together?
If you have a Kindle Unlimited subscription, the books are available to you for free. I have no plans to change that at the moment. So if you're curious, check it out. I love my Kindle Unlimited subscription because it allows me to try books before buying them and to figure out if I like a new author. So it's $10 a month. I'm not sponsored by them or anything, but I think it's a good investment to find new people that you want to read.
Absolutely. I mean, books that you don't have to pay for, I never complain. Although I do I encourage supporting authors as well, but
yeah, we get paid by the page. If I end up liking the first 30 pages of a book, I'll probably end up buying it just so that I can keep it, because you're only allowed to keep, I think, 6 or 7 books
right
in the library that are limited. So if I really am enjoying the book after the first, 30 pages or maybe the first 5 or 6 chapters, I'll usually purchase it at that point. But it kind of depends. But we get paid either way. So Kindle Unlimited is a great way to support authors if you don't have a huge book buying budget.
Yeah, that's perfect. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about the books. Thank you so much for joining me.
And thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you again to Zachary for first being flexible about the interview and then taking the time to talk to me about the Eternal Chronicles, the first two books, Eternity's Well and Eternity's Mirror. If you are a fan of young adult books or you have a young adult reader who loves fantasy and who loves urban fantasy, then you should definitely check this out. There are also, again, those religious and spiritual elements. There are elements of allegory and world religions, world culture, myths, those sorts of things. So there's a lot of different myth and fantasy elements pulled from a lot of different cultures and religions and societies. So if that is something that is of interest to you, then you should definitely check these books out. Again, there will be 5, and the third one is going to be out shortly. So you will have 3 to read in quick succession, which is always great when it comes to fantasy books, because that's not always the case when you get sucked into a series that you like. So, as Zachary said, if you are a Kindle Unlimited member, you can check them out for free on your Kindle Unlimited, which is pretty great. So, thank you again to Zachary. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners, for joining me for another author interview. I hope that you will join me next time. We're switching from young adult and fantasy to contemporary murder mystery set in England. I'll be speaking with author Connie Berry about her newest mystery book, so please join me for that interview on the next episode. In the meantime, as always, if you are a fan of this podcast and you have not already done so, make sure that you like, subscribe, follow on whatever platform you listen on. That way you always know when there's a new episode. And also, if you are inclined to leave a review, please do so, written or starred, or both. Helps greatly to get the podcast out to more listeners who love books, and I would be very appreciative if you took the time to do that. Also, if you're on social media, you can follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and or TikTok. Love to hear from listeners. Interact with me. Tell me what you're reading. Ooh, it's spooky season. Tell me what you're reading for spooky season. I am, of course, reading for the podcast, which I love, and then listening to a paranormal romance series, the Nocturne Falls series by Kristen Painter. I'm listening to that on Audible. So it's Nocturne Falls, the town that the series is set in, bills itself as celebrating Halloween 365 days a year, so that seems perfect to listen to during the month of October. But come find me and tell me what you are listening to during spooky season. Hope you had a great week. Hope that you have some great weekend plans coming up. But as always, whatever you're doing, I hope you stop and take some time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.